Welcome everyone to Drisha's spring program, and this is the sixth and final class of this session on the Halakhic process, a brief history with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring.
So this is the last class in the series. It's been a lot of fun learning, and hopefully we'll cover the two topics that I included for today, and hopefully we'll get a chance to learn at some point together in the future. So last week, what we dealt with was the question of how the shift happened from the primary halachic organizational principle, at least for custom, being geography, to a family custom, or more precisely, ethnic or sub-ethnic custom, things like Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Hasidish, Litvish, whatever the case may be. And we traced halachically and historically how that phenomenon came about after the writing of Shulchan Aruch, and how that affected halachic development going into the 20th century. So today I want to touch on two questions. One very briefly, because as I mentioned, Rabbi Dr. Hidary dealt with it more extensively in his course as part of the spring semester on Rav Uziel. And that's what we'll start with. And that is the question of, is this really ideal? Right? We talked about last week how we justify and how we get to the point where historically, where we shift from geography to ethnicity. And the reason we tried to figure out why that was true halachically was because we know that that's how we experience it, that people continue to identify as Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Hasidish and etc., and keep their customs. But that's more of a descriptive and at some level legal question. But then you have to ask yet one more question, which is this the ideal? Is it ideal that we're in this situation where we maintain these multiplicity of identities? Or is the ideal that either one tradition become dominant, or that a new tradition entirely be forged such that there is a unified tradition? So this question was really quite pressing at the beginning of the state. So in the late 40s and the early 50s, as the idea that Jewish people from different cultures around the world would come together and join in one place, and definitely for Zionists and especially religious Zionists, the idea that that was a fulfillment or the beginning of a messianic process in which kibbutz galuyot, in which the ingathering of the exiles is part of that vision. So both philosophers and halachists were facing the question, when these people come together, they're bringing, for whatever reasons we talked about last week, their halachic customs and identities. Should we encourage them to keep that? Or should we forge a new Jewish Israeli identity, not just in the social sense and political sense, but in the halachic sense as well? And there were essentially three views that emerged, but the different views are most, I think, clearly seen through the lens of the first Sephardi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, of Rev Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel. I'll share the screen. And like I said, I won't spend too much time on it, but I think it's an important question to touch on. And this is what I call the melting pot or mosaic question. Right, America traditionally viewed itself as a melting pot, where the ideal vision of how people coming to America would integrate was by becoming American, by at some level giving up at least some of their distinct identities and adopting an American identity. And therefore, America was often referred to as the great melting pot. Other countries, like Canada, never had an interest in that. And they prided themselves in being multicultural, right? That to be Canadian was to bring your culture and keep that culture even in Canada, and create a mosaic, right? A mosaic of different types of Canadians. Sociologists have suggested all types of different models. In addition to the melting pot or mosaic, if you go on Wikipedia under melting pot, you'll see there's melting pot and then there's mosaic, but there's also this salad bowl imagery, which I'm not exactly sure. It's supposed to imply a different type of mixing. And then there's the kaleidoscope imagery, where the extent to which things are integrated is constantly changing. Sociologists have fascinating things to say about this, but let's keep it simple with this melting pot mosaic dichotomy. So Rav Uziel was received the following question. I'll just look at my translation here. Rav Uziel was asked by Rabbi Levitsky, who was the rabbi in Tel Aviv, as follows. He writes that as thank God in our days, the settlement in our holy land has increased, may it continue to increase. Many of our brothers have gathered here from all scattered parts of the exile with unique customs and prayer and the like, each as he received from his parents, that he has been accustomed to his whole life. And each loves his father's customs and won't move from them. On Sukkot, I saw regarding the shaking of the lulav that there are many different customs, which with many divergences. They all pray together in one synagogue, and each follows his custom, and good comes from this as peace reigns. The same is true for differences in prayer and liturgy, tachanon. As much as possible, each keeps his own custom. This is a daily occurrence with no breach, and there is peace and tranquility. However, I am afraid that there may be a violation of making factions. What's known in Hebrew as lo titko dedu. Don't create factions. At least that's how the Gemara understands it. So this rabbi turns to Rav Uziel and he says, isn't it beautiful, essentially, if I reframe it, isn't it beautiful that the reality in Israel nowadays is the mosaic? All these Jews come, they're Ashkenazim, they're Sephardim, they're Hasidish, they're Litvish. And here on Sukkot, you see some people are shaking in this direction first, some people are shaking in that direction first, all types of prayers. When it gets to Kaddish, so some people will say it with V'yatzmach Burkanei V'karev Mishichei, some people will say it without that phrase. You have a few Teimanim who will have the long addition later on in the Kaddish, and everyone is happy, and everyone keeps their identity, and everyone gets along, and it's beautiful. But Rav Uziel is worried, Levitsky is worried that as beautiful as it is, maybe it's a violation of the prohibition against factions. So if I have to get into Rabbi Levitsky's head for a minute, I would say as follows. His intuition is that the mosaic is the ideal. That which we talked about last week, the shift from geography to identity that enables multiple ethnicities or sub-ethnicities and cultures to exist in one shul, that's an ideal, that's beautiful. In his head, there are two possible responses he can get from Rav Uziel as to whether it's proper. One is, you're correct, this is beautiful, and it should be encouraged. We should encourage people to keep their cultures, to keep their halakhic customs, and let's celebrate the mosaic. Possibility one. Possibility two is, it's beautiful, you're right, but what can you do? There's a technical halakhic prohibition of presenting multiple customs in the same place at the same time because it looks wrong. It creates it makes it look like the Torah is splintered. And therefore, despite the fact that it's beautiful, we should discontinue it or maybe separate into different shuls or something like that. That's not what happens. Rav Uziel responds, not only is it wrong, but it's also terrible. Meaning, not only do I disagree with you halachically, but I disagree with your intuition that the mosaic is an ideal. I like the melting pot. And he writes, among all the virtues that distinguish and separate Israel from all the nations, first and foremost is the wonderful union of this nation in its Torah, which is the foundation of its nationality and the secret of its eternal existence. Thousands of years have passed since the revelation at Mount Sinai, and the Jews have been exiled many times, and from nation to nation, from kingdom to kingdom, with many decrees imposed on it, and its teachings to destroy or falsify it, to confuse its letters, disrupt its intentions. Nevertheless, despite all this, Judaism came out pure and complete in its character and spirit, united and unified in its foundation, and all those who tried to harm the unity of the Torah, the Samaritans, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Karaites, and the sects of the disciples of false messiahs were completely lost or exist in a pathetic existence which will only disappear from the world. This unity emanates from a faithful source of the Torah of the living God, who is the only one in the world, unique in the heavens and in the earth and all their legions. And therefore he commands his faithful prophet of his house to say, just as he is the only one in the world, so shall your work be special and singular to him. And therefore he says, we have learned from this that it was not permitted to make factions, except in cases such as Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities, which are separate in their customs and distinguished as special divisions. In any case, the law turns out to be very well that all the customs of prayers, performance of mitzvot, and halakhic rulings that are publicly performed in one synagogue, they are in general guided by the prohibition against factions. And it is very close to saying that this is a mitzvah that brings about a sin. And it is clear that it is not a mitzvah of the finest kind. We are commanded to maintain and emphasize in all our situations and work for the rock of our salvation to create unity within Israel and Torah. So Rav Uziel says to him, listen, right? You're not just wrong halachically. Your intuition is off. You think that the ideal is the mosaic. You're wrong. The ideal is the melting pot. Is there to be unity of practice amongst the Jewish people? And he makes a radical theological claim, which is the reason we want unity of practice is because God is one, and therefore the Jewish people, by reflecting godliness, must reflect oneness. And therefore, ideally, there should be no divergence of practice whatsoever. At the end, he acknowledges that if there are people who are Sephardim and people who are Ashkenazim and they want to keep their identity, that is legitimate. But what you see from Rav Uziel is the opposite inclination of Rabbi Levitsky. Rabbi Levitsky said, it's clear to me that multiple traditions are the ideal, they're beautiful. Maybe there's a technicality that makes it that in a given shul, we should have a unified practice. Rav Uziel comes from the opposite direction and says, maybe if you force me, I'll let Ashkenazim and Sephardim keep their own traditions. But that's really a less than ideal situation. The ideal would be unity of practice. And therefore, definitely in a single shul, you should have unified practice. And I think that this back and forth highlights the next step in our sort of journey that we started last week. Right? Again, last week we dealt with the question of how did we get to the point that we maintain these subcultures within halakhic practice? But the next question you have to ask is, are we happy that we did? Rabbi Levitsky says, yes, we are, because there's a beauty in a multiplicity of traditions. And Rav Uziel said, if I have to tolerate it, I will. But the more we can move towards unity of practice, the better. And therefore, and again, I'm not going to go through the whole history, but one of the things you discover about Rav Uziel is that much of his life's practice was devoted to minimizing the differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Psak. And in fact, as much as he acknowledged that it was legitimate for Ashkenazim and Sephardim to keep their practices, whenever possible, he got rid of those differences. And therefore, there were a series of decrees made by the Batei Din, by the religious courts in Yerushalayim in the 50s, in which the rabbis got together and said there are certain things where we need unity of practice. And the rabbis voted on whether they should adopt the Ashkenazi or the Sephardi custom. Inevitably, they always chose the Ashkenazi custom because the majority of the rabbinate at the time was Ashkenazi. But Rav Uziel, because of his belief that the ideal is to move towards a unified practice, consistently was willing to vote in favor of Sephardim giving up their unique halachic practices in favor of the Ashkenazi Psak. This manifested itself in for example, in Yibum, levirate marriage, when a person dies childless. The standard Ashkenazi position is that the preferred course of action is that the wife of the deceased, who is now quasi-married to the brother of the deceased, should perform the quasi-divorce called chalitza to end the union between her and her ex-husband. That's preferable over performing yibum, the levirate marriage, in which she marries her brother-in-law. The Sephardi position, traditionally, was to prefer yibum over chalitza, even in cases where that would mean that the husband, let's say the brother-in-law, would end up having more than one wife. And they believed that the preference for yibum was so great that it even overpowered the decree or custom against polygamy that's been prevalent for about 1,000 years. And Rav Uziel was willing to give up on the Sephardi tradition in order to maintain unity. Rav Ovadia Yosef, when he became chief rabbi, and really before as well, fought very hard against Rav Uziel because he felt that Ashkenazim should keep their identity, Sephardim should keep their identity, and it was terrible to move towards a melting pot world. The mosaic, as it were, was his ideal, and therefore he was offended by the notion that Sephardim should have to give up their practice simply for unity with the Ashkenazi rabbinate. And this question of whether the keeping of subcultures is ideal, and therefore we should fight for Ashkenazim to keep their customs and Sephardim to keep their customs, or is at best a begrudging acknowledgement of the reality on the ground, but something that we should actually work against to create an Israeli identity, and maybe an American identity, and a Canadian identity, and a British identity with unified practice, or maybe this is unique to Israel. I'm not going to weigh in on that. That seems to be two visions of what direction halakhah should have taken as the old traditions based on geography were broken and people moved into these conglomerate areas of Israel and America and the like, where you have some poskim like Rav Ovadia Yosef who celebrate the mosaic and say it's not just the fact that we're allowed to keep our ethnic cultures, but that's the ideal. And people like Rav Uziel who said, no, the ideal is to get to the point where we adopt a singular practice. I saw a few months ago that Rav Avram Stav posted that apparently Rabbi Eliezer Melamud, who the author of the Peninei Halakhah series and a leading religious Zionist posek, has slowly but surely in his psak over the years attempted to diminish the differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And in fact, apparently when someone gives a halakhah shir in his yeshiva in Har Bracha and suggests that Ashkenazim and Sephardim should maintain different halachic practices, they have like a stucca box. You know, like some people have like a swear box that if you use use a swear word, so you have to put some money in the swear box. So he has a box that if you suggest that there should be different halachic practice between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, you're allowed to suggest that, but you have to like pay the price because to acknowledge that it's not ideal. And you do see that a lot of religious Zionist thinkers are moving more in that direction. So as much as we talked about last week, that the reality that people experience is that they keep their subcultures of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and the like, that is breaking down to an extent, at least in certain parts of the Halakhic community, especially in Israel, where people are moving towards the unified model, which would build on what we talked about last week, recognizing that geography is, in the end of the day, supposed to be more powerful than identity. Okay, so that's my overview of that topic. Like I said, it's a topic in and of itself. This is just the brief overview of it, but I do think it's an important question to deal with in light of what we talked about last week. I'll pause here for questions before I move to the second element of what we're going to talk about. Nachum, I see your hand up. Yes.
So one question is just trying to understand, having read the doctoral dissertation of Rabbi Lau, he seems to articulate that Rav Avadia wanted to gravitate more to a unified position in that thesis, unless I misunderstood it. I could have, since my Hebrew's decent but not perfect.
so what Rabbi Lau notes in his dissertation is that you have mixed language in Rav Avadia. That Rav Avadia, his main goal seemed to have been to return the pride to the Sephardi community. In order to do that, he did a few things, right? He emphasized Sephardi unity by eliminating differences between quote unquote Sephardi communities, right? Right. So therefore, he fought against the right, so to speak, of the Iraqi community or the to follow the Ben Ish Chai, right, or the Moroccan community to follow the Chida. So on the one hand, he argued for unity within the Sephardi camp, but on the other hand, he mostly argued for the legitimacy of diversity between Ashkenaz and Sephardi, right? Now, sometimes he overcompensates and says, I'm willing to let Ashkenazim do their practice, even though they're really wrong, right? But I'm willing to tolerate that. But it's not clear whether that's because he wants a unified practice or he's overcompensating to defend against the Ashkenazi hegemony, to defend Sephardi practice, right? An argument along the lines of, really, you should be following us also, but I'm willing to let you do your own thing if you leave us alone, right? So unclear. So you are correct that Rav Avadia has a little bit of multiple things going on. He has a collapsing of Sephardi identities into a pan-Sephardi identity. Sometimes he talks about Jewish unity, but usually as a weapon against the imposition of Ashkenazi hegemony. More often, he collapses Sephardi identities into one Sephardi identity, but allows and maybe even celebrates the possibility of Ashkenazim versus Sephardim. So you're right. There is a bit of an ambiguity in Rav Avadia in that sense. Rabbi Lau devotes, I think, about half the book, right, to this question, because at least two sections touch on this question in different ways. But you're correct, right? It's a little bit more complicated than we can get into here, but there is a little bit of both in Rav Avadia. Part of it also has to do with his opposition to halachic rulings based on Kabbalah, which de facto means that he often collapses different subcultures amongst the Sephardim because he doesn't like those cultures that follow the Kabbalistic influences in Psak, right? So there is a little bit of overlap of different things that are going on in his methodology, but you're correct, right? Rav Avadia deserves a much greater analysis, hence Benny Lau's excellent dissertation.
What about the notion of Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim? That doesn't seem to be, a b'diavad position. That seems to be a position of admiration. How does that figure out?
So you're right. But, and I think maybe Evie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that I saw in the description that one of Dr. Levins's classes is on this point. I think.
Okay.
I believe.
Yeah, I think it touches on that. Correct.
So
Okay, so I
I'll
think
be
that's
attending
true.
and I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'm not 100%
Okay,
sure, but I think so.
So I'm pretty sure. So I'm gonna punt on it. I will just note that you're right. The Gemara celebrates it, but the question of whether that actually implies a fundamental pluralism of practice or only recognizes the epistemic limitations of human beings and therefore celebrates the attempt to find truth and follow what you think is truth, but doesn't actually celebrate the possibility of multiple truths. Right? That's one of a very complex question within that, and I'm 90% sure that that's what Dr. Levin is supposed to talk about. Okay, good. So I'm just going to leave it then and leave it for him for this series. Okay, good. I'm glad I checked the description. I haven't caught up on all this year yet, but I'm glad I caught the description so I know what else is being discussed. Okay, fine. Second half, and this is very much related to what we did last week as well, is the following. Half of the reason that we've maintained our halakhic practice based on subculture is based on what we said last week, is that we have traded in geography for culture, okay? And we talked about that and how we got there again. We talked about that last week. But there is another mechanism that gets us to the modern moment. And that is the question of how do you define Mardatra? Now, what is Mardatra? So last week we talked about practice, minhag, but there's another halakhic mechanism that is traditionally geographically based, and that is the notion of literally the master of the place. Mardatra, or maybe you've heard it in the Ashkenazi, which is Mardasra, which is the term that people colloquially often use for their shul rabbi. But what it literally means is the master of the place, because there used to be an idea of a local rabbinic authority based on whose authority the community ruled and practiced. And this is something that the Gemara celebrates. It downright celebrates. So the Mishnah in Shabbat and Kuf Lamed tells us that there was a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva as to whether the preparatory stages for a Brit Milah overrode Shabbat. Everyone agrees that a Brit Milah performed at the right time on day 8 overrides Shabbat, because the actual performance of the Brit Milah, which draws blood, is a violation of Milachah, it's a violation of Shabbat, but the Torah tells us that nevertheless it can be performed on Shabbat. But Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva disputed what to do if you forgot to make a knife, or sharpen a knife, or carry the knife for the Brit Milah. Do the preparatory stages of the Brit Milah, do they override Shabbat or not? Rabbi Eliezer tells us, Im lo hevi kli me'erev Shabbat, mivio b'Shabbat miguleh. If you forgot to bring the knife before Shabbat, so bring it openly in public on Shabbat, and everyone will understand you're doing it for the mitzvah, and that's fine. Rabbi Akiva says no. Klal Amar Rabbi Akiva, Kol melacha she'efshar la'asotam erev Shabbat, eino dochet haShabbat. She'eh efshar la'asotam erev Shabbat, dochet haShabbat. Anything that could have been done before Shabbat does not override Shabbat. Only those things that could not have been done on Shabbat override Shabbat. Now, Rabbi Eliezer's position becomes the minority position and is rejected. However, despite the fact that it's not the accepted position, the Gemara tells the following story. Tana Rabbanan, bimkomo sheRabbi Eliezer, hayu kortin eitzim, lasot pechamin, lasot barzel b'Shabbat. In Rabbi Eliezer's place, they would cut wood to make a fire, to sharpen and purify the metal, to make a knife for the Brit Milah on Shabbat. Meaning they celebrated his position. They went all out and they would do anything they needed to do for a Brit Milah on Shabbat. Similarly, it says that Bilkom Moshe Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Haya Ochlin Basar Of Bechalav. Rabbi Yossi Haglili had another minority position, that you were allowed to eat chicken, poultry, and milk. Again, minority position, but still, in his place, they kept this. And the Gemara seems to have no problem with it at all, and downright celebrate it. And later on in the Gemara even talks about how the people in these cities would live long lives in the merit of them having to have listened to their local rabbi. So the Gemara takes it as a given that the standard halachic model of authority is your local rabbi, and that following his position, even when it's a minority position, is an ideal. Touching on Nachum's question, right? That this does seem to celebrate multiplicity of positions. And it does seem to. In this case, it seems to celebrate. What's the halachic rationale for this? So in a very surprising comment, the Ritva writes that the pasuk that normally we understand as granting authority to the high court in Yerushalayim, the Beit Din Hagadol, Lo tasur min hadavar sheyagidu lecha yamin u'shmol. You should not veer from that which the high court says left or right. The Ritva, writing in the 13th century, argues that that authority, that power actually inheres in everyone's personal local rabbi. And that's why it's legitimate to celebrate the notion that you follow your local rabbi, because they are invested with the power of lo tasur, of God's command that you listen to the halachic process and the authorities that represent it. Okay, great. That worked in the world that we talked about last week, 500 years ago, when people still related to their city, their geographic area, as the central locus of the way they defined their halachic practice. But as we talked about with custom, that broke down over the last 500 years. So what about this related notion of Mardatra? This related notion that your primary halachic authority is your local rabbi. How has that model fared as the world globalized and people moved away from their original location and communication became such that you can easily talk to a rabbi in another city, in another country, across the world? You can email, you can call, you can WhatsApp, you can Facebook, you can whatever you want to do, but it's easy to contact your chosen halachic authority, whoever that may be, wherever that person lives. So what do we do? So Rabbi Aaron Kirschenbaum in an article a while ago already in Tradition highlights the extent to which the traditional model of authority based on locality has faded. And he writes, first and foremost, the alienation of the masses of our people from halakhah has diminished the locality over which the local rabbi is master, from the autonomous judicial community, kahal of the Middle Ages, to the particular Orthodox synagogue from which he draws his salary. He says, first of all, most Jews in an area aren't necessarily keeping halakhah. And therefore, even were every halakhah keeping Jew in an area to accept a particular posek, that authority is much diminished from a time in which the entire community cared what halakhah said. Point two, but even for the halachic observant Jew, the telephone and automobile have rendered city a meaningless term, and locality, which is now limited to the individual synagogue, may paradoxically also refer to a huge geographic expanse. In the British Empire and the state of Israel, the maintenance of a chief rabbinate has decreased significantly the role of the traditional Mardatra. Indeed, the chief rabbis themselves are often viewed as the Mardatra of the entire country. A challenged proposition, but definitely one that was offered. Also, and now he adds a third and fourth point that weakens the notion of local rabbinates, and that is specialization has overtaken the modern rabbinate, so that rabbi, rabbinical judge, teacher, and communal leader are seldom incorporated in one man, right? So the modern world, because of communication, because of globalization, and because of specialization, which makes it that your local rabbi may be an expert in kashrut, but not in Eruvin, has led to outsourcing questions of Eruvin, which takes specialties, or the creation of a mikvah, which takes which has become a specialty. So all these factors have begun to chip away at the notion that the classic model should be geographic. And then he adds the final factor. Finally, the emergence of Roshei Yeshivas, Halakhic decisors, whose authority transcends geographic boundaries, and even more so the walls of the individual yeshiva, has contributed much to the near demise of the traditional Mardatra. Not only do their disciples turn to them, not only do the laity turn to them, but the communal rabbi, the local Mardatra himself, as a former Talmud, as a former student, also turns to them for psak and guidance. Indeed, the telephone has done much to undo the role and stature of the old-time Mardatra. It would therefore appear that the Mardatra, in the traditional sense, survives today chiefly in small communities or in communities far removed from the main centers of contemporary Judaism, i.e. in Israel or in urban America. It is hazardous to predict the future of the Mardatra. Nevertheless, it would appear that there are no significant factors on the horizon in contemporary Jewish life that could stop the historical, sociological, and technological processes that are bringing this concept to the vanishing point. So that's a pretty strong statement. And I think, honestly, mostly correct, right? As we talked about last week, the notion of maintaining a geographic model is hard to justify when the world is shaken up. And once you've accepted a model of a locus of identity and culture as more powerful, you would assume that Mardatra would go the same way. But the truth is that we need to ask two questions about Mardatra. So Rabbi Kirschenbaum has, I think, compellingly argued that there's good reason to believe that the traditional idea of a geographic power has almost been eliminated. But there's a second half of that question, and that is, has it been reconstituted? Meaning, maybe the geographic idea of Mardatra has died, mostly, not entirely, but mostly, or at least as a binding category. But have we reconstituted that notion, just like we did with Minhag, along identity lines? Meaning, could we argue that you're no longer bound by your local rabbi, but you are bound to the posek that you choose? Because you choose your posek based on hashkafa, right? Based on worldview. If you're Haredi Litvish, so then Reb Chaim Kanievsky is who you're going to listen to. If you are Hasidish, so your Rebbe is who you're going to listen to. If you're modern Orthodox, then you have, right, your own teachers, whoever they may be, right? And the way that you will view halachic authority and gadolness will be different, admittedly. But is that legitimate? Can you reconstitute the idea of a Mardatra not based on geography, but based on identity, like we did with custom? So I think you can, but here's how it works. So I'm gonna do this a lot outside to make sure we cover it, but it's all here and you can look at it. The first move towards redefining Mardatra happened in the Rashba. So let's highlight what we got to do. The original model of Mardatra was very simple. The rabbi was local and the community was local, right? The rabbi was the authority for the community that lived where he was. The Rajba was asked, can you break half of that equation? So he said, there were places already in his time where entire cities had decided that instead of following just their local rabbi, they were going to adopt the positions of the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the 10th century authority, or the Rambam, right? Maimonides, right? The great 12th century authority. So he was asked, is that legitimate? Is it legitimate for these cities to make the Rambam and the Rif, as it were, their Mardatra, the local halachic authority? So the Rajba, I want to be clear, is asking half of the modern question. The people asking are communities, are cities. So the community is still geographic. But the first question that would break down the traditional notion of Mardatra is, can a geographic community choose a non-geographically located halachic authority? And even more so, a dead non-local halachic authority. So again, the community who will accept the authority is geographic, not ethnic or cultural. It's geographic, but the halachic authority is not. The halachic authority is some posek that they identify with. So the Rajba says, yes, you can. And he invokes the example of Rabbi Eliezer, right, who we already saw. Everyone celebrated the fact that the people in Rabbi Eliezer's town followed Rabbi Eliezer. And then he says, "Umin haderech hazeh," following the model of Mardatra, kol shenagu lasot kol ma'aseyem al pi echad migdolei poskim. Anybody who would accept following one halachic authority, b'makom shenagu lasot kol ma'aseyem al pi hilchot harav Alfasi zichrono livracha, like those people who've accepted to follow the Rif, or v'mkomot shenagu lasot kol ma'aseyem al pi chibur harambam zal, or those who follow the Rambam, Hare asu elu hagdolim kirabam. So they've made the Rambam and the Rif their authority. Now he does qualify it, and he says, unless their local authority tells them specifically, I disagree. Because he says, in that case, she'ein elu kirabam mamash. You can mostly replace the Mardatra with a virtual, even dead halachic authority, but at the end of the day, they're not really your authority. So if your local, personal posek wants to rule differently, they can. But what the Rajba opens up as the possibility is that the geography can be broken, at least for the rabbi. The community, again, that may accept the rabbi is still geographic, but the rabbi is no longer local or even alive. And this model is echoed in many poskim later on. So in the Shut Chaim Bad, he says that this model explains why people accepted Shulchan Aruch. They made Rabbi Yosef Karo, even if he was dead, the rabbi of all Sephardi lands. And the Ashkenazim followed the Ramah, right? And basically the same thing that the Rajba did for the Rambam and the Rif, so later on happened for Shulchan Aruch and Ramah. But then you have to ask the next question, which is, okay, the Rajba says that Mardatra, we can break down the notion that the rabbi has to be local, but the community doesn't have to be local. Sorry, does have to be local, has to be geographic. Can you flip it? Can you say that not only does the rabbi who holds the power of the Mardatra no longer has to be local, but that the community who accepts a rabbi no longer has to be a geographic community, but rather can be a ethnic community or a community based on joint philosophy, right? So Hasidim following their Rebbe, modern Orthodox people following, I don't know, their teacher who they identify with, who shares their values, right? A woman deciding that she wants to ask Nida questions only to her yoetzet halakhah, right? Because she believes that women should be involved in the process, and therefore she identifies with asking that to her yoetzet, whatever the case may be, right? Can we now say that the group of people who decide they identify as Satmar Hasidim can follow their Rebbe, even if I break the geographic nature of the community and not just the rabbi? So my late teacher of Aaron Lichtenstein argued, yeah, meaning once the Rashba said that Mardatra is the rabbi doesn't have to be local, but you can choose him because you identify the rabbi, then the community doesn't have to be local either. Because that means you can define communities just like we did last week based on identity. So here I have two quotes, one from Rabbi Halakhic, who's expanding on Rav Lichtenstein's position, and then the original quote from Rav Lichtenstein. So let's look quickly here at 10 and 11. Rabbi Halakhic writes, this ruling of Rashba moves the concept beyond the limitations of specific time and place and makes the ideological and halakhic affiliation with a particular authority's rulings at the center of the mandate. One can plausibly extend this concept beyond the boundaries of any reference to geographic area as well. Once one claims that the concept of following the view of an individual scholar extends beyond his death or his actual place of domicile, the road is clear to an expansive reading of this notion. Thus, a Belzer Chassid who lives in Cape Town, South Africa, or a transplanted Washington Heights Yeka who was a member of Kilat Adat Yishurun and was now living in San Jose, could continue to follow the practices and psakim that they felt loyalty to in their day-to-day life. And Rav Lichtenstein in source 11, in his article, Legitimization of Modernity, Classical and Contemporary, expands on this. The definition of the relevant community, however, is murky. The Gemara speaks of locale, but it seems that geography should be the sole determinant. Would an enclave of Judean emigres in Galilee be permitted to eat chicken fried in butter? Would only residents of 12th century Egypt be entitled to rely upon the Rambam's minority kulo? It seems far more likely that other factors, ethnic identity, or above all, spiritual and ideological fealty, should carry no less weight. I believe that this is clearly suggested by the Rashba. In this vein, if they've been accustomed to act consistently in accordance with the halachot of Rabbi Fassi Zal, or in places in which they've been accustomed to act consistently on the basis of the Codex of the Rambam, they have in effect established these Gedolim as their Rebbe. Physical proximity is obviously not intended here. What is envisioned is evidently rather a principled and consistent attachment. Its basis is left open. The places cited could have come to be accustomed to doing all their actions in accordance with the dicta of the Rif or the Rambam as a result of either accident or choice. The point is, however, that spiritual commitment rather than geographic contiguity is the determinant factor. A Sephardi congregation in Warsaw could still be bound by the rulings of the Rishon LeZion. Would a Ger Chassid cease to be part of the Beth Israel's community just because he moved to Paris? The implications for a contemporary Orthodox Jew's legitimization of his response to modernity are self-evident. And here, Rav Lichtenstein points out why this is important in the modern world, because it's not just true in halakhah, it's true in hashkafa, it's true in worldview, right? Do you embrace Zionism, modernity, or reject them? He said, were there no genuine gadol who had subscribed to the core halakhic positions of what is roughly denominated modern orthodoxy, ordinary rabbis and laymen would be hard put to cling to them. In the absence of an imprimatur from any shofet shebiyamecha whatsoever, from a great judge in your generation, it would be difficult, and if not impossible, to justify adoptions of norms and values in defiance of a wall-to-wall phalanx of Gedolei Yisrael. Such action would be simply regarded as error, whether b'dvar Mishnah or b'shikol hadat. One's contemporary authority, no doubt, bases himself largely and perhaps selectively upon classical predecessors. But the ordinary person must base himself upon a shofet shebiyamecha. And then he goes on, right? And for him, the reason that he wants to say this is, even if we limit our purview to the confines of our own bailiwick, it is self-evident that over the span of half a century, the imposing presence of our collective Rav Mufakdal was sufficient to refute this perception. And obviously he means Rabbi Soloveitchik. And so Rav Lichtenstein argues that not only can we break the geographic hold on halachic authority and even hashkafic authority, we should redefine our communities based not just on Ashkenazi or Sephardi, but ideological commitments, and thereby create legitimizing halachic authorities by attaching to those people whose vision we share about what halakhah should be. So I'll take questions in just a second. What this tells you is that what's true of custom, as we talked last week, is true of the other way of getting at the exact same point, right? Is that part of the reason that Shulchan Aruch got accepted and Ramah was accepted was because that was the custom. The other half was a move towards redefining Mardatra as a local authority for a local place to being an ideological community, accepting the ideological authority that they base themselves on. And therefore, while Rabbi Kirschenbaum highlights the way in which Mardatra as a geographic category broke down, Rabbi Helfgott and Lichtenstein reconstituted along identity lines or ideological lines. And I think this is the last point we really have to make in sort of our journey to the modern moment, because it's not just true that we have reinterpreted Ashkenazi-ness or Sephardi-ness as an identity rather than as a geography, but globalization and the ability of communication and people's connections with their teachers rather than their local rabbis have suggested that another axis, another way that we view modern halakhah is on ideological grounds, and the communities that we form and the halakhic authorities we relate to and give credence to reconstitute the idea of community for halakhah and philosophical purposes along identity lines, which in the case of some customs may be about Ashkenazi Sephardi, but in case of other things may be along ideological lines like, do you accept or reject modernity? Do you accept or reject the notion that Zionism is a positive or negative part of the modern world? And I think that all of these together bring us really to the modern moment, right? This move away from geography to identity, the reconstituting of community along ideological lines has really, plus the question that we talked about in the first half of today's year, the question of whether we really want to remain with ethnic identities or we want to start moving towards unified identities like Jew, Israeli, or something like that. And the question of how to balance all those factors, I think well describe the complexity of the modern moment, right? And so much of the modern moment and modern halakhah is fights over these questions, right? People who say the local rabbi should have the right to paskin for his community are at some level rejecting the notion that geography is no longer important. The people who no longer turn to their rabbi of their shul, but turn to their teacher who they learned with when they were in Israel 20 years ago, right? They are implicitly accepting an identity, an ideological notion of community rather than a halakhic one, rather than a geographic one, rather. The people who start to break down the difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi are celebrating the kibbutz galiot, as it were, and saying that holding on to ethnic identities is holding us back from creating an ideal world in which everyone follows a unified practice, right? And so many, I think, of the disputes and the arguments over halakhah are because we as a community are still working out the extent to which we're still functioning in geographic models. Are we functioning in ethnic models, ideological models? What happens when there's a conflict between them? Are we fully comfortable in one model, or are we trying to create hybrids? But so much of the halakhic argumentation and the disputes in our communities are, I think, because as we've talked about in the last 2 weeks, so much has changed in the last 500 years. And what used to be simple, that communities and their authorities were all geographic, has totally broken down and be called into question. And what people are struggling with is reconstituting what community means when so much of halakhic history was working on a different paradigm that we have. So I hope that over the last 6 weeks, we've painted a picture of how we got to the 21st century. And what I think are the major challenges in terms of defining what it means to have a halakhic community and what that means for who has authority and who grants them that authority. Is it their geography? Is it their identity? Is it their ideology? Those questions, I think, are quintessentially modern, but we've gotten to the point that we are because slowly but surely the classic models have been broken down over 500 years of galuyot, expulsions, printing presses, increased communication, increased publication, all of which forced us to ask what community really is and what that's going to mean for halakhic authority. And really the challenge now that poskim are dealing with is how do we want to proceed? And honestly, there are different voices. There are communities that are still very geographic. There are communities that are very into their identity, but are less likely to be based on ideology, right? They're very strong Sephardi, but it's not about whether they're, Zionist or anti-Zionist Sephardi, they're just Sephardi. And then there are people who only turn to poskim that they ideologically agree with, right? And you see that this breakdown of traditional models and the reconstituting, both for custom and for halakhic authority, really, I think, describes the modern moment. And I hope over the last 6 weeks, as we've taken it, we've done a journey here of 3,500 years. We've at least gotten a snapshot of how we got from the Torah to the complex situation of how we view halakhah and community and halakhic authority in the extremely globalized, ever more connected world of the 21st century. So with that, I thank everyone for a fun 6 weeks, and I will turn to the questions that I have here. Okay, one question. So you can have in one shul different practices based on who you consult as your posek. Yes, if you think that community should continue to be defined culturally or ideologically, so then yes. The fact that you're in one shul shouldn't matter. It should matter what community you've chosen to identify with. If you think that this is all a mistake, that we should go back to the geographic model and this breakdown the geographic model over the last 500 years was a problem, then no, every shul should have their own practice and unified practice. Is there a difference between private and public spaces? And yes, that is. Unfortunately, we can't get into that too much. It is possible that you could say that in principle, people should be allowed to hold their individual cultural identities, but maybe a particular shul needs to have unified practice because maybe in a single place there is, there's something particularly egregious halachically of having multiple practices in one place. And I did give you here in source 16 that Rabbi Helfgott does take that direction. That even though he thinks that in general it's legitimate to reconstitute halakhic authority and practice based on identity and ideology, he does think that maybe in a public space, in one shul, you should have unified practice. And that's what he writes here. It would seem, however, that public manifestations of a practice that fly in the face of the accepted custom of a specific town, or in our contemporary context, synagogues, would not be sanctions. Such actions would contradict the principles outlined in the 4th chapter of Psachim that require one who moves to a new locale to accept the public practice of the community that one is now residing in, especially when public actions to the contrary would cause discord and strife. So there might be technical reasons why, at least in one shul, in one place, at one time, you might want unified practice, even if fundamentally you buy the notion that geography is no longer as important for halakhic practice and authority as ideology and identity. Yeah, that's a good point. Let me unshare the screen. That will help me. Okay, good. Other questions? Nachum, yes, you have a question, go.
One question, one anecdote. So I'll tell you the anecdote first since it's at the end, right?
Okay.
So coming from the Hasidic background that I do, my tradition has been not to eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, right? Notwithstanding the Gemara. I have a Litvak father-in-law, so when he retired and came to our house, I had to decide whether kibbud of, or my family minhag is more important. Talk about ideology. So I didn't really know what to do. So this is a little bit of a show off. So I call Atara Soloveitchik Twersky, and I said, when your father ate in your house in the sukkah, what did your husband do? And she said, he went out to the sukkah and ate with his father-in-law. So you see, things vary. My question, which is a bold one, at what point, because of this question of, let's call it ideology, or what I call sometimes what resonates with you spiritually, can you arrogate through process and through learning the decision for yourself? In other words, your conclusion, even including Rav Lichtenstein, is really, in the end, you still need to turn, to some sort of ideologue who's going to respond. I'm not talking about a technical question of medical practice where you need an expertise. I'm talking about a more ideological type of response, especially in light of the fact, as you said, there's so much mass communication. I turn again to Rabbi Benny Lau, who authored a whole article about the internet, where people in very popular type questions can go to the internet and see, many answers for themselves from many leading authorities. And so, now that's called shopping. But at what point is the flip correct? That there are certain things ideologically, as you gravitated, I'm not saying you were all the way there, that you ideologically resonate with.
So I'll say this. When I first started teaching halakhic process, so my first year of teaching halakhic process, I gave a series of shiurim on what factors do halakhic authorities take into account when they decide halakhah. That was year one. The second year I was teaching halakhic process, I tried to figure out what I could do that would build on that. So the second year I called the role of the laity in the halakhic process, where I focus on the opposite question, which is, okay, that's what halakhic authorities do, but how much right do non-halakhic authorities have to make their own decisions, or more precisely, at what point can you make yourself a halakhic authority, and for what purposes, at least for yourself? And that took me another year. So I've thought about the question a lot. I tend to be pretty liberal on it, but the answer is long because it took me a year to develop my thoughts on it. A year of an hour and a quarter shiurim every week when I was in the Kollel and Gush, where I just sat down and said, okay, I need to answer this question for myself. So the answer is, I think you're right, that in many cases, you can be your own authority. And I know that's a controversial statement, though I'm willing to put my name behind it. But the exact parameters of that, I cannot explain briefly.
I'm happy to
but
call
I
you.
will say that it's a combination of recognizing the complexity of the question and how much expertise you have, one. Two is dealing with the question that is debated in poskim. Even if someone is surely qualified as a posek, does bias make it that sometimes it's worth turning to an outsider, not necessarily even greater than you, just someone not you, for an outside opinion, where it might be surprising, but it is a very large dispute amongst poskim. The clear majority of poskim think that bias is not a problem. You are allowed to poskim for yourself, though there are outliers, at least in certain types of questions. But basically there are three factors to it, right? Which is, how complex is the question? How much of an expert are you? And how much should the fact that you're posking for yourself affect whether you want to go to an outsider to avoid bias? I happen to think that in all three of those, there's a lot of latitude. And therefore, I'm pretty comfortable with people when they are qualified poskening for themselves. But that obviously leaves a lot of room because we have to answer all the other questions. And there's all types of complexities there as well, because, you could also say that, look, a posek should determine the theoretical halakhah, but it should be left to the individual to determine whether their situation fits that, right? So let's say a posek could say, if you feel really stressed, then there's room because of shat hatzchak to be lenient. But maybe the right thing is to then say, but I'm going to leave it in your hands to figure out whether you think it reaches that level, right? So there's all types of hybrids that come up because every halachic question has multiple factors: the halachic statement and the assessment of reality. And a pure psak needs to meld them. And it could be that you turn to a posek for advice on the theory, but you maintain your own right to weigh in on the reality. So to throw out why this might be important, though it's controversial, right? Rabbis who will say, I think this usually comes up in women's issues, this shouldn't happen because I think the women are doing it for the wrong reasons. What they're essentially saying is this would be permitted if they were doing it for the right reasons. Statement one. Statement two is, I don't think they are, right? But it might be very legitimate to someone to say, I agree with you, right? A woman might say, I agree with you. If I was doing it for the wrong reason, I shouldn't do it. But I don't think you know my inner world, right? And therefore, in practice, I disagree with your assessment, right? I think that's a very fair, right, critique, right? So it could be that you think poskim can weigh in the halakhah, but you have the right to weigh in on the relevant reality on the ground, which obviously determines how the halakhah comes out, right? If you want, you can email me afterwards, and I can send you some source sheets where I dealt with this question. I hope one day I can write up my thoughts on it, but again, it was a year worth of material, so it'll take me time. Okay, I think I'll pause here just for a second. I see that, Dan, you have a question, but for Evie, I'm going to first, before anyone else runs out, I want to thank Evie for all her help for this during the last 6 times. And Evie, why don't you make your announcements, and then I'll answer as many questions as you want, but why don't you make the announcements now so that everyone who wants to leave.
Are you sure you don't want Dan to ask his question first?
It's up to you when you want to make the announcements.
But it's okay, because I have to stay until the end anyway. So okay, we can Dan, do the questions. But thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure. Dan, what's your question?
Ahead.
Thank you. I was thinking about something we said at the beginning of this session. Why it's relevant, I'll say in a second, but the source about Rabbi Levitsky, how he said that I actually my response, the way I read it was a little different, and I don't even know if Rabbi Uzziah, who was responding to it, read it the way I read it, but he was the point that was made was that Rabbi Levitsky sees as an ideal the multiplicity of practice. But I actually thought it wasn't really clear what he was saying, because he was saying on one hand he's not sure what to believe, and the way I thought, and I'll say again why this is relevant in a second. The way I thought he read it was that not necessarily that it was an ideal, but that given that the people with different views, isn't it so nice that they can get along even though they're not doing this ideal, as a possibility of reading it. The reason I wanted to say that is because one thing that has to be underscored is that everyone would agree, even and there's been so many views we've discussed here, it's been thought-provoking, but one thing that has to be underscored is that everyone would agree that, I mean, it's so obvious in a way, it's basic, but that Jews getting along is fundamental. Everyone agrees that's a positive. The reason I'm saying that is because I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The idea that Rabbi prevents, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't remember exactly what he said, but hold on.
I can pull it up. I can pull it up again.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I just stutter so much.
No problem. I'll just pull up the sheet. I'll pull up the source for you. Wait, here we go. Where are we? Here we go. Yep. If this helps you.
Well, that was Darabuzia. What's his original session? What Rabovetsky said. I only.
If you want the original in the Hebrew, it's
no, in English is better. Oh, there was no. It wasn't. Oh, okay.
No, I don't have his. I have it as formulated by Ravuziel. I don't know what the original letter said.
Oh, right? So I guess I was just taking then my position might be even more flawed, because I was basically on what you said, but the idea that I want to just present to the fore. We talked about what's it called, shaving panim l'Torah, but there's another quote is that hinei ma tov ma'anim sheves yachad, like you were saying, it's just a beautiful thing that these Jews are getting along and together. I'm sorry, I thought it was clear in my head. I sorry for taking your time.
So let me put it this way. There's actually, I wrote an article about this a while ago, based on an article by Ray Clapper, where the prohibition that is part of that conversation of lo titgodedu, of not creating factions, there seems to be a fundamental dispute between Rambam and Rashi, whether the reason that it's wrong to have factions is, the Rambam says, because people will fight, right? It'll lead to machloket. And Rashi says the problem is that the Torah will look like two Torah. Shelo yeh Torah kishtei Torah. Interestingly, at some level, I don't just think that there are two ways of saying the same thing. I think they're actually opposites, for the following reason. Let's say that I decide to have a Seder with my next door neighbor, okay? And I say, in my house growing up, this is how we did the Seder. And my next door neighbor says, in his house when he was growing up, this is how he did the Seder, right? We won't fight because we acknowledge that we had different histories, right? We might try to figure out what we're supposed to do at our Seder, but we won't get into a fight of, no, you didn't do that in your house, right? Because we admit that we have two different pasts. But if my sister and I get together for a Seder and argue about what we did growing up, right, we will fight, because we're claiming the same tradition, but we're arguing about what that was. So bringing it over here, at some level, if you say the reason not to have factions is because you're going to fight, then if in the end of the day people have different practices but they won't fight, then great. But if you think the problem is that the Torah will look like two Torah, fighting is actually better than not fighting. Because if you don't fight, then you're admitting that there are two Torah. But if you fight, then what you're implying is that there really is one Torah. We're arguing about what it is, right? So as much as we like peace, the value of avoiding factionalism might actually limit the extent to which we like peace, right? It might actually be that we would rather people fight and come to a single practice than let everybody go their own way. Because peacefully letting everyone go their own way is acknowledging that the Torah has sub-traditions, right? Whereas fighting, having a spirited fight about what the shul should do, at the very least, it may be very bad in terms of fighting, but it's good in terms of the underlying message, which is we should share a tradition. We're just trying to figure out what that should look like, right? Or what that is. So I think it's actually more than that. Yes, everybody will agree that there's peace, but I'm not sure everybody would agree that that's the ultimate value. And they might even think it's worth fighting if the result is going to be uniformity. And if there's not going to be uniformity, fighting still might be better than becoming okay with Judaism splintering into peaceful but varied traditions. So I think that's part of what lies behind it, is that we all want peace, but there might be an implied danger in peace, right? Because it might imply a fundamental pluralism, which people might not be comfortable with. And I tend to think Rav Uziel is actually on that place, where as much as he wants people to get along, he would rather them fight and come to a single conclusion than give up on the vision of unity. So
Well,
you
so
know,
much.
so
It really
it's
clarifies a lot,
it's
actually.
complex. What?
It really clarifies a lot, and thank you. It really helps me.
Yeah, no, I saw where you were going, but like this is one of the things. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but once you put your finger on it, you realize that at some level, fighting has a beauty to it, because it means that we deep down agree that we should be sharing a tradition. We just don't know what it is, right? And we have a vested interest in the right tradition being the one that wins, right? So I think Rav Uziel might even be okay with fighting, right? He likes peace, obviously, but his desire to see people believe that the ideal is unity, right? Not unity in the sense of peace, but uniformity, right? Like unified practice might even override the value of peace, and he might prefer the kicking and screaming. You know, he might. I can't put that. I can't say for sure. But there's definitely reason to believe that, you know, kicking and screaming is not always a bad thing. It implies something beautiful, right? Which is that we acknowledge that we have a shared tradition and we care about what that shared tradition is, rather than just being okay with having different traditions. Yeah, that's my thought on it. It's, and it takes a while to sort of get to that point, but I think the family mashal helps, right? Because again, siblings fighting about what we used to do at home, right, are going to fight in a different way, but everyone understands the reason they're fighting is because they're siblings, right? And they had a shared home, and that's why it matters to them, right? And it's specifically because they're unified, they're one, right? They're one family, that they're less likely to be okay with you do your thing, I'll do my thing, right? And there is a beauty there, even if it's cantankerous. Okay, do we have any other questions, or are we calling it for the series? Oh,
I do.
Okay, Nachum, yes, go.
So in that family, and I'm not expecting that you'll go off on this, if there's fighting in the bigger family, there needs to be a certain dignity of purpose. And I cite a recent example of the Supreme Court of Israel declaring what it did about conversion. Longer saga, but there needs to be dignity in fighting as well.
That I agree with, right? That I agree with, meaning right? There's
I
fighting
get the
maybe.
differences. I get the differences.
Oh
if
no,
it
for sure,
needs
I
to
agree
be.
with you. Fighting may imply something important, but there's still different ways to fight, right? You can disagree
all
respectfully,
I'm
you
saying.
can disagree disrespectfully. Point taken, right? Yes.
Last thing I just wanted to say is, it's interesting in terms of the laity, because I'm old enough to be able to say that I had a struggle with the issue when I was going to go to Israel for a holiday as a diaspora Jew the first time, whether I was going to keep one day Yontif, or 2 days Yontif, and I knew the position, of Rav Soloveitchik, and I, would refer to him generally as my Rebbe. But it didn't, I knew it wasn't going to resonate with me, to be in Israel and do Isra Malachah on the second day. And I know the, positions of, the Shulchan Aruch and contemporary of Rav Moshe, which suggests that you do 2 days. And it was just one of those things that I had to identify for myself, really on to the limit of my knowledge, what was more of the famed minority opinion of the Chacham Tzvi. So ideology comes into it, and you see in time, at least within what you're calling the modern Orthodox camp, this has definitely, taken on more root. But that's an example of where ideology comes. You could identify any number of perhaps sociological reasons for it today. I'm not talking about somebody owning real estate in Israel or he's going to return. Just, you're there. So you do what in Rome the Romans do.
Yeah,
So,
I think you're definitely right that certain questions, and this is definitely a paradigmatic example, the line between halachic community and ideological community are very much related, right? Because I think that people's views are often shaped, and I don't say this in a bad way. I think it's I think it's a legitimate thing. I think that people tend to be influenced on this issue by overarching ideological concerns. And yeah, I do think for that reason that there is a divide between the modern Orthodox community, which is probably more accepting of day or day and a half, or whatever you want to call it, positions than 2 days. And probably part of it is, there are definitely poskim who are very explicit about that, meaning there are religious Zionist poskim who say, well, you should keep 1 day because, yes, if you were a ben chutz la'aretz, you would keep 2 days. But the second you step foot in Israel, you should never leave. And therefore, you are Israeli, whether you like it or not. If you choose to leave later, that's because you're just evil, right? Meaning that's clearly right. That's an ideologically tinged position, right?
I love it.
But I do think at some level, you're right, that certain issues, there's more than halakhah going on. There's ideology, and I don't think that it's necessarily bad. Ideology often does shape which halakhic positions. I once heard Rabbi Linzer make the point that in truth, right, most people on the halakhic spectrum believe that ideology has a role in psak, both on the extreme right or the right and on the left. It's only the center that denies it, right? Haredi poskim will always invoke ideology. They call it das Torah, right? And on the left, they're explicit as well, right? There is like a certain modern Orthodox centrist, brisker view that idealizes law as completely separate from ideology. But the truth is that that's probably a minority position that falls between the two sides of the spectrum, where ideology is much more integrated into psak itself, which was part of his argument that it should be that way, right? That it's sort of anomalous in the history of halakhic thinking that that ideology should not. Obviously, it's not the only determinant, but it is a factor, and explicitly so. And I think at least descriptively, he's right. Whether prescriptively that means anything, I'm not going to weigh in here. But descriptively, I think he's definitely right that, you open most Haredi Tshuvot, ideology is explicitly invoked, right? And, this is not like a left-right divide. It's a left-right on one side versus the center, where certain like legal positivist purists in have developed who believe that this is not the case, which may be right, may be wrong. Again, I'm not weighing in on it now, but I think it is definitely a very well-trodden path to say that ideology should affect halachic decision making. I think that it descriptively that's compelling. And again, I think anyone who accuses that person of doing that because they're modern, you have to realize that again, it's the left and the right that do it. Meaning, Haredi posts can do it just as much as people on the left. There are certain people who envision halakhah not like that, right? And in the Haredi camp also, Chazon Ish very rarely does this, right? Chazon Ish is his psak is much more ideologically neutral in that sense. But I think he's an outlier in Haredi psak as far as I can tell. He still might be right, but I don't think he's a majority. But that's my impression.
Thank you. I also want to thank you for just such a wonderful set of shiurim that you've given. I've studied the subject and it's really helped enlighten me. And I thank you so much and hope to be in touch.
Thank you for your contributions. It's made it a lot more fun. And the more I'm challenged on things, the more I continue to think about these issues, which is good for me, right? These are the things that challenge the way I think about Torah. So the more I'm pushed, the better, the more I feel, the more I feel like I'm understanding at least what I don't understand, and the more I'm forced to stake out my own view of what halakhah is. Well, I guess on that note, let's call it for the series. Evie, again, thank you for all your help these 6 weeks, and I'll turn it to you for announcements.
Thank you so much. This was really a great series. We really, really, really thank you, Rabbi Ziring. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today, all your great comments, everyone here on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our spring program tomorrow at 1 p.m. with a class on the world of doubt, between human and divine, between law and reality, with Rabbinate Shimoni. That's tomorrow at 1 p.m. It will also be live streamed. In addition, we have many more classes happening now and always. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or you can watch live at www.drisha.org/live. And just to remind everyone that the classes are recorded, and you can always go back and watch older classes that were recorded. So you can watch this whole series again. And thanks again, Rabbi Ziring, for the opportunity to learn with you. I hope to be with you in class again in the future. And I hope to see everyone else at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. And again, remember, you're always free to reach out to me with follow-up questions. My email is on all the source sheets. So go back to those, and feel free when you think about things to send me an email, and we can continue this conversation even after the series is over. Okay. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night. Good night and good afternoon, everyone.